Thank you, everybody, again, and good afternoon. It is for me to introduce Professor Jansen to you, and it is a great privilege to be able to do so. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Professor Jansen. He is Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of Stellenbosch, President of the South African Academy of Science, and the Knight Hennessy Fellow at Stanford University. His most recent books include edited and co-authored collections. They are South African Schooling, The Enigma of Inequality, 2019, Decolonization in Universities, The Politics of Knowledge, also 2019, Fault Lines, A Primer on Race, Science and Society, 2020, Who Gets In and Why, Race, Class and Aspiration in South Africa's Elite Schools, 2020, and also Learning Under Lockdown, Voices of South Africa's Children in 2020. Now, before we start, before Professor Jansen starts, let me just say how we're going to do this. Professor Jansen's going to deliver his lecture. You, in the meantime, can put your questions in the chat feature. After the lecture, I will look at the questions in the chat feature and ask them. You also can put up your hand, and then I can ask you to ask your question, and Professor Jansen will answer. So with that, please welcome Professor Jansen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madee, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at the UCT Summer School in a forum that I suppose none of us could have anticipated with the pandemic lockdown, but hopefully the next time we do this, it could be face to face. I grew up in Cape Town on the Cape Flats in Steenberg and Retreat, and of course in those days you went to schools that the government had decided was for your particular classification group. And so I was always fascinated, even as a child, by whatever the comparison was between the school that I went to and the school, for example, across the road from Princess Alice, where my mother worked as a nurse, which was Swansbeek. And I always used to wonder, in my the mind of a child, why is their school so different? Why does it look so grand? Why do they have these sprawling, green fields and all of that? And so on, but I always didn't calculate that in political terms at all, except that there were white kids there and the rest of us were somewhere else. So that sort of stuck in my mind somehow. And of course, as I grew older and started to understand how, our society was formed, I became more curious about schools and the way they look. I studied education, became a teacher, studied education all my life, and then became intrigued by what schools looked like, not so much as a social curiosity or, as a child making fairly simple calculations, but as a scholar, as somebody who was intrigued not only by the way things were, but why they stayed the same. And so come 1994, and we have a democratic government, and all of us could vote, and we all say we are equal, at least in terms of the law. But of course, it was too obvious that we were not very equal in terms of the day-to-day lives of South Africans. And so since I drive up and down the Cape Town streets past schools that are both, completely derelict and schools that are so incredibly grand, I started to, as a scholar, say to myself, I wonder not why it exists, that part I knew historically, but why it continues to be the way it is. And so I was very fortunate to, when I moved from the Free State back to Cape Town a few years ago and settled at Stellenbosch University, I was very fortunate to have some very smart doctoral students and postdoctoral students to take on different kinds of research projects that I'm involved in, one of which was the study of schools. And Samantha Krieger was my doctoral student. She graduates, by the way, in a few weeks' time. And she did the work on something completely different in a dissertation, which really is about music and the teaching of music in grade 1 classrooms across the Western Cape. Anyway, so Samantha and I then did this research over a period of 2 years, put together a book, which I will show you the cover of at the end of the lecture. And the title of the book is Who Gets In and Why? Race, Class and Aspiration in South Africa's Elite Schools. Now, by the way, elite here does not mean private schools. It means, as you'll see in a minute, schools that are fairly well off in resource terms, both public and private. Now, we started the book with a question that I've always felt was so incredibly powerful. It's a question that intrigues anthropologists in particular, and it goes like this, that the task of the scholar is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. So if you drive up and down the streets of Cape Town and you see really amazing schools and really horrible schools, we've taken that for granted. You know, we've just sort of go by, and in order to stay sane on the one hand and just, you know, continue with your life on the other, you sort of park what you see as incredibly ridiculous in terms of inequalities, and you move on. And yet, for those of us who, you know, work with ideas and so on, we have a responsibility to make what is familiar strange in order to ask new questions about what we see. So in the background, you have a shot of a part of Cape Town that I'm sure you're very familiar with, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, that is for sure, and so on. And yet, as you all know, behind that incredible physical beauty lies social ugliness that the sooner we confront it, the better we are to be able to deal with it. So that's the title of the talk. Let's get into the business side of things. Next slide, please. We were interviewing the principal of the primary school of one of the very, very elite Cape Town private schools. And in the course of many of these interviews, of this particular interview, the principal said something that both Sam and I immediately took note of. And she said that this southern suburbs is probably the most untransformable area of Southern Africa. This is not said by, you know, as somebody outside of these schools. It's somebody who actually works with these schools and is, as I said, a leader. And we were struck by the honesty and obviously by the challenge. You know, why is it that the southern suburbs in particular represent such a challenging dilemma for those of us interested in change? Next slide, please. So we started with, we studied 30 primary schools, starting up in the City Bowl with Jan van Riebeeck Primary Afrikaans Public School, and all along the main road down to Bishop, where we ended with one of the public schools there. And as you know, if you drive along that main road, you'd see all of those schools there from Herschel to, you know, the Grove and so on and so forth, up to or down to Paul Greling, which was our primary school at the other end. And we have in the book some wonderful ways, thanks to geographers who helped us at Stellenbosch University, to sort of plot these schools and their small areas, as people call it in the demographic world. Next slide. It was very clear to us that to answer the question, why are there so many predominantly white schools, public and private, in a predominantly black country, more than 20 years since the legal end of apartheid, this fascinated us. And it was very clear that the way to get at this was through a very close-up study of admissions policies. In other words, what is it in admissions policies that enable schools to maintain a white upper middle class status regardless of the changes in the political sphere? Now, of course, these are questions we used to ask about universities as well, but you will not find any university in South Africa today in which the majority population, as far as the student body is concerned, is predominantly white. There are universities that still have a way to go, like Stellenbosch, for example, and one or two others. But by and large, our universities have transformed in a way that all of our people, regardless of the past, are fairly well represented in the student body, if not yet in the professoriate. But in schools, it's a completely different matter. And so we went into those schools, we interviewed principals, we interviewed teachers, we interviewed former teachers of the schools, in other words, teachers who were there much earlier in the 1990s and saw how these schools changed over the course of time. And we studied the documentation of the schools. We looked at photographs of children over the years represented in the school magazines. Went back to some of those schools for more in-depth interviews and eventually came up with a story. And what the story tells us is that there are at least 7 or 8 instruments, we call them, in the admissions policy that enables schools to remain the way they are. One is the zoning policy, which I'll talk about each of these in more detail, which is, as you know, decisions around whom to take into the school in terms of the geographic area in which families live. Second, the school fees, straightforward. Thirdly, sibling privilege, that is schools that give you automatic admission if there is a sibling at the school. Heritage status, which means that you have access to the school if you had a parent or grandparent there. Early lock-in, which for us was a very important and not obvious like the others instrument of admissions policy, in that schools could take in children way before grade 1, and I'll show you how that works just now, in ways that keeps the school white. Social selection, schools don't only make decisions based on, measurable and perhaps agreeable measures, such as do you live in the area or not, but also on a very subtle but nonetheless powerful set of decisions which we clustered under social selection. Status projection, it is very important to schools what they look like to the outside world, especially in terms of infrastructure, and there's a whole literature on that, and we explored that in the context of these 30 primary schools, and then of course admissions tests, which schools do administer, not all of them, but many of them do administer in order to make admissions decisions. So what we're going to do now is to go briefly through each one of these and then end up with a proposed theory for why these things still stay in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about the zoning policy. Most of these 30 primary schools obviously exist in white residential areas, and so it is in in purely rational terms, and assuming a perfect world, that a school would make decisions around who gets in based on whether you live in the zone, so to speak. So on the face of it, this seems to be a fairly reasonable proposition, especially with primary schools. You don't want children traveling for miles and miles. If a kid lives in Rondebosch, you don't want, you want to give preference to the kids who live in Rondebosch to attend one of the Rondebosch schools. Again, on the face of it, and assuming there is no history, this sounds like a fairly reasonable idea, except, of course, that it's not reasonable when you look at how the zoning policy is in fact maintained. So let me give you a few examples from the study. So it became very clear to us very quickly that the zoning policy was a fairly flexible instrument, in that schools would, very often using GPS technologies, would decide the outer border of the zone depending on how many students they had. So if in a particular year there were too few boys at a boys' primary school, the school would expand the zone slightly in order to be able to take in more children. So it's not like the zone is set in stone, which means two things as I teach my students here at Stellenbosch. It means you could use the zoning policy to transform the school if it's flexible, or you could use it to keep the school the way it is. And that is a political act. Okay, that is not simply a decision based on area. It is a decision based on who we want to be, what we want to look like, who we want to enter, or otherwise. The other thing that we found out is that the zones were applied in a way that if you work with the concept of a radius around the school, then of course, if you did that consistently, then everybody around the school would obviously get access. But it doesn't work like that in practice, and this is what makes it so frustrating to study zoning policy, because it was very clear to us it was a political game at the end of the day. However rational and decent and logical the schools presented their case. Let me give you one example. In Pinelands, there's a primary school that we studied, and the principal made it very clear that they take people within the zone of schools around Pinelands, which again, on the face of it, sounds rational. Except if you really did a radius the way you did it at school, which is, a full 360, then of course you would not only take the kids who were in the white side of Pinelands, but the kids just behind the school in Langa. And so my co-researcher said, but sir, if you use that logic, there'd be a lot of kids here from Langa. No, that's not what the radius implies. The radius implies the white side of the school. So that's quite disingenuous. I think it's quite, it's quite obvious that this was a way of keeping the school white, not a way of keeping the school, of being, ruthless with respect to the instrument itself, which says if you live in a geographical zone, you come into the school regardless. So the zoning to us, was an instrument that some schools, to their credit, did use to get in more children who were more diverse. But other schools quite simply use it as a blunt instrument that is flexible in order to keep their schools white. I wish I could put it to you in more subtle terms, but that would be dishonest in itself. So that's the zoning policy. Now, of course, our schools and our residential areas tend to work together. In other words, it's not an accident, if you lived in a particular area for the past 30 or 40 years, that the schools in that area, because of apartheid, would be white and privileged in the main, and vice versa. But of course, now that we are at least formally outside of those strictures, you would imagine that schools that are genuinely dedicated to transformation would be more inclusive and give everybody a chance to study at these amazing public and private schools. So that's the zoning policy. Let me go to the next slide. School fees. Now, this is actually a very, very interesting instrument in that a lot of parents don't apply to schools simply because the fee structure is a disincentive. You see a fee, by the way, I don't know if you guys saw this week or a few days ago, that was a business tech put up the fees of schools, of the most expensive schools in South Africa. I don't know why I still get shocked that you could go to schools, mainly in Durban, by the way, where the fees would be like 300,000 Rand a year, you know, combining tuition and admission. 300,000 a year, I mean, that's a solid deposit on a reasonable house in most parts of the country. 300,000, and that's just assuming one kid. But it was very clear to us that a lot of people don't apply to school simply because the fee structure sends a message. It sends a message that this school is not for you, this school is for those who can afford it. Now, because race and class are very closely related in the history of South Africa, it doesn't surprise us with this graph that we generated that the higher the school fees, the whiter the school, okay? And that obviously shouldn't surprise us, but it does make the point that very few black parents would be able to send their children to schools where, you know, you pay upwards of 100,000 Rand a year to keep your one child in the school, etc. Now, one of the things that is important just to sneak in here is that not all white schools in the southern suburbs, or for that matter in South Africa, you know, were always privileged in terms of its fee structure. And so in places like Wetton and Lansdowne, before those places became overwhelmingly colored by residential occupation after '94, some of those schools were actually, I suppose, in today's terms, poor white schools, you know, and we were quite surprised to find that some of the schools already had black kids in there years ago because it was affordable, even though it wasn't legal in such cases. But those schools, like in the Wetton area, rapidly turned from being white schools, mainly Afrikaans, by the way, because of the military installation nearby, and became predominantly colored for the sake of the context, as those parents mainly fled to the northern suburbs of Cape Town. Anyway, the point for here is that the fees are an exclusionary device that, if it works together with zoning, really makes the admission policy a very powerful lever in terms of who gets in to the elite schools, and so on. And the question I'm sure some of you are asking, but why doesn't government change this? Why doesn't government simply flatten off the school fees in such a way that everybody can attend any school regardless of fees? Well, that's a long and fascinating story that goes back to the 1990s, when the negotiation between the ANC in particular and the National Party included agreements that there would not be a ceiling put on what parents through their private contributions could pay in terms of school fees. Now, that's good and bad. As somebody who believes that government mustn't tell people what to do when it comes to where they send their kids to school, that's great. If I want to pay for something more, that's fine. The problem, of course, is this is South Africa, and what this means, in effect, is that that schools will remain the Indeed, public schools and certainly the private schools will remain white regardless. It's simply because of that unwritten agreement to enable parents to pay anything they wish in order to keep their kids in school that they like. So this is a big issue, and again, it mustn't be seen in isolation of the other instruments. Next, please. Sibling privilege. Now, I have to say to you, as somebody who didn't grow up with this particular kind of awareness of sibling privilege, I mean, I just cannot think of anything more directly discriminatory than to say, you know what, if you've got a brother or sister at the school, you can come here as well. Again, rationally, that makes a lot of sense. You don't want a parent dropping off 3 kids at 3 different schools, etc. It really does make sense to drop the kids off in one place and say this is what the sibling policy allows. The problem is that the more siblings you allow in on that basis in a school that was historically white, the less likely kids are likely to get in who don't have siblings there, who don't get in first. And in fact, in several of the primary schools, the sibling numbers were so high that in the grade 1 class, there were 2 or 3 places left open once you accounted for siblings. Now, you know, in the late 1970s, people in the sociology of education used to talk about the reproduction of privilege. You can imagine those were mainly economists at the time. But this is the reproduction of privilege. And it's horrible. So here you have a sense of which schools have those kinds of 26 out of 30 have a sibling privilege clause, which enables those schools to stay the way they are, etc. So from siblings to the next slide. So heritage status. Now, this is even more absurd than sibling privilege, because it does mean that if in the 1930s, because remember several of these schools are centurions, they've been around for 100 years, like some of our, like UCT, for example, or Stellenbosch. And what this basically means is simply because there was a parent or grandparent, you get in automatically, etc. Now, again, think about this. Who were the parents and grandparents in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? It was white people of middle class stature or upper middle class stature. And that immediately cuts out and so on. So again, if you combine sibling and heritage status, just imagine how little space they use to transform the school with kids from different backgrounds. It is, as the New York Times put it in a very, I thought, powerful description of this problem, engines of inequity, because they work to keep things the way they are. Now, I have to say that this is more prevalent, heritage status, in high schools, in the former white high schools, than in the primary schools. And one of the main reasons for that is that it is very much the sense of loyalty to the old boys and girls. This is very much tied to funding. So it's very difficult to get rid of this policy, even though many of the primary schools have, in fact, or at least they tell us that, have tried to jettison this particular arrangement. But, you know, if you go to almost any school and you see the infrastructure that is built, the new computer science lab or the new, drama and arts building and so on. So that comes from parents who buy into this transactional loyalty, really. That, you know, you've been good to us and our family over the years, we will support you in turn. Now, I think that's nice, by the way. I think that's a really good arrangement. But the consequences of that, for those who would like to also have access to these superb schools simply don't get in as a result. Next slide, please. So this is a very, very interesting thing, and I have to unfortunately take a few more minutes to explain what's going on here. Now, if you take in all children at grade 1, then 80 or 90% of those kids would go through the primary school as a cohort, and then when they move to grade 8, they would move in most of these 30 schools to a almost a connected school. So if you're at Rondebosch Boys Primary, you normally go to the senior school. If you're at Herschel Girls Junior, you normally go to the Herschel Senior School at the Commons, etc. So there are destination schools, either by virtue of the schools being brother and sister schools, or by virtue of tradition, that the kids from this school mainly would go to that school in high school. So you're locked into the school, and if you take that cohort through grade 1 to grade 7, and then in high school from grade 8 to grade 12, the point I wish to make here is that the school basically stays the same for the majority of children and so on. Here's the problem. Government requires schools to make it known to parents who can't afford the fees that they can get in grade 1 by virtue of the subsidy. So there's some complex calculation that is made that if you can't as a parent afford the grade 1 fees, you know what, government would make available a large portion of those fees depending on parental income and the like. So what do schools do? They either don't tell the parents that, okay, or if they do, they try to limit the number of no-fee parents. Why? Because your ability to have more teachers, and particularly teachers in specialist subjects like drama and music, depends on everybody paying their part of the fees. And so if you're in a not very wealthy school, it becomes quite a big problem if the percentage of no-fee students is so large that what the government gives you, which is always much less than if you had paid the full fee, means that you struggle. And there's a very interesting school, again in the Lansdowne, Wetton area, which is quite transformed, by the way, with an outstanding principal that made it very clear, that they take in a lot of no-fee students, but they have to fundraise to make that up. Otherwise, they can't afford basic things like swimming pools and the like that distinguish these schools from the rest. So what do schools do? And I'm not suggesting at all that this was designed as consciously designed as a way of keeping the schools white. But what they did was to add on, this wasn't always there, to add on a grade below grade 1, a grade R, a grade double R, and even lower, so that you can take in children in these pre-formal school grades, okay, without the burden of the no-fee arrangement. In other words, if you get into the pre-grade 1 classes, you only get in there if you're able to pay the full fees, which is quite enormous even for the preschool years. What are the consequences of that shift? It means that the kid in grade RRR gets into grade RR, gets into grade 1, and now you're locked in, okay? You were locked in, first of all, outside of the statute, outside of the arrangements for no-fee schools, but you're paying. And now you go through the school system through 7 and 12, and because those numbers are large in the pre-grade 1 years, the the room for additional students is very small, very close to zero in some cases, etc. And in that way, given who can afford those high fees, in pre-grade 1 years, the school stays white. Okay, and we have very good graphics in the book to show for different kinds of schools. So you've got to ask yourself, how on earth is it possible that in 2019, when we finished the book, 2020 rather, that you can have a school in which more than 90% of the children is white. Now, even if you're conservative and you don't care a damn about other people's kids, it's so obviously wrong, you know? and yet we haven't until now had a good sense of how schools engineer their admissions policies, consciously or otherwise, in order to give us these kinds of outcomes. And so for us, this is something that needs to be fixed, obviously, but it's going to be very difficult to do because of the political arrangements, which I'll conclude with just now. All right, the next slide. So social selection is for me very interesting. And I just think I have to remind myself, I have to remind you, that most of the schools in Cape Town, certainly most of these elite schools, are actually products of colonialism and obviously products of apartheid. And many of these schools have an Englishness in their culture. Some of them were very closely tied. In fact, if you look at the origins of some of these schools, it originated in Britain. And the first principals of some of these elite schools were in fact transported here from that part of the world, because these were English schools, you know, in the main, and so on. And with that came an understanding of English culture, English, selectivity, that to this day is very keenly felt in some of these schools. So I can't imagine. I mean, it's very hard for me to understand, let alone accept, that you would take in grade 1 kids, and they would come with their parents. This happened in several of the elite schools, English schools, and have them with their parents in the principal's office with the admissions officer, and have the kid run around and make decisions based on certain behavioral characteristics about whether this is really a boy who should be admitted to SACS or not, or and so on. So the operations of this is well described in one of our chapters. Is what do the schools actually do to select kids? When you get into grade 8, I didn't know this. This happened by pure accident, that a principal gave us during the interviews a sheet with a list of questions that was sent to the school to say, so-and-so has applied from primary school X to high school Y, answer these 10 or so questions about the kid. Now, I would understand if those questions were about academic attainment, if those questions were, but you know what the questions were? Do the parents pay the school fees on time? What kind of child is this? Okay. Are there any problems with this, that, and the other thing? In other words, nothing to do with what should be, you know, the main entrance requirement, which is, you know, academic performance. It now is a whole lot of things that have got nothing to do with your potential academically, and a whole lot to do with who your parents are, what they can afford, whether they can pay, where you live, what your address is, and all of that nonsense, and so on. And then comes the kid into the principal's office, as I said in the earlier a picture and the kid runs around and you see the kid using certain words and being out of control and you start to make decisions. White parents will tell you that freaks them out because a 6-year-old or 5-year-old kid in your office, like kids anywhere in the world, will climb on, as somebody put it, you climb on the principal's head, and try to balance, would creep under a chair. That tells you nothing about. In fact, I'm more likely to look to kids who show levels of energy as opposed to just sitting there looking prim and proper. But these are and then you ask the parents questions, and this is one of my favorite questions. And they ask the parents, so Dad, what books do you read to your kid at night? Now, if you're from a working class family like I was, your parents didn't read to you books at night. They were too bloody tired after a day at work, slogging away to read a book every night. They might read it now and again or give you books, but etc. But this is what I mean by social selection. It's a way of tuning out those who don't fit the image of of that particular school. So I'm going to give you one more example because this intrigues me in its ruthlessness. So at a particular school, which I obviously won't mention, 2 boys graduated from the school. In other words, they went through the school and went on, to high school and took different jobs. The one boy, they were twins. The one boy became a doctor, and the other became a mechanic. And when their children applied to the same school that they went to, it was only the children of the doctor who was taken and not the children of the mechanic, even though there was a sibling policy and a heritage policy in place. This is ruthless, this is wrong, this is obviously unfair. And yet schools do this. And a lot of parents who apply to the schools don't have a clue as to why they didn't get in because those rules of the game, like this one, is not on the website. What you're more likely to see on the website are the obvious things, like the fee structure of the school and maybe the zoning policy, but not these invisible threads of the spider web, as we call it, etc. Next slide. Status projection. It is very important to the school. And again, there's, as I said, a literature on this, that schools invest quite a lot of money in making sure that, on open day, parents can see that there is a hockey field and a drama room and a sports bar or whatever the case might be. This matters. Status projection in the literature on schools selection policies is a very powerful way of saying who we are and so on and so forth. And parents, of course, schools need the money, the fees, in order to maintain this kind of infrastructure. And sadly, we saw schools in Muizenberg, for example, where as the clientele changed, if I may use that language, as the schools started to get more black students, the white parents fled. The school could no longer afford to maintain the swimming pool or the hockey field or whatever the case might be. So this is a huge issue. Your ability to retain paying parents depends in large part on what you project about yourself, especially in terms of infrastructure. Right, next one. Next slide. Admissions test. Now, to test kids for admission to a school is illegal. You're not supposed to do it. And yet there are schools that do this, okay? And one way in which they test for admission is, of course, to check on the language capability of the children, by which is meant English language. And one principal, who was an outgoing principal of a very fancy school, said to us, listen, we don't have the facility to take isiXhosa children and then teach them English and then to teach them the curriculum. Now, again, from a pedagogical point of view, this makes perfect sense. You want children who are able to do well in English and so that you can concentrate on the other stuff. But just imagine if every child was selected purely on this basis, on your basis to speak English, the schools would remain more or less the same. And the children who would get in, like my children, because their mother tongue is English, would be children of the black middle classes and so on, which you see at these schools, okay? A small percentage of black middle class kids, but very, very few, if any, children from working class or poor families, simply because of their inability to speak English at the level required. And one other principal said to us, we only take those who can afford are linguistically able in English. Now just look at this sentence. Okay, what is linked here is the ability to pay and the ability to speak English, which I don't know about you, but that is offensive on the face of it, because you cannot make those kinds of decisions based on, your financial capacity, which you assume is linked to your ability to speak English. As an English speaker, I find that deeply distressing, but that's what it is. And next slide, please. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all the other interesting aspects of the study, except to say the following. It is very important to acknowledge that white children who enjoy disproportionate access to these elite schools are not there on merit. If you still, after this lecture, believe that, you've not been paying attention. They are there based on privilege. So the notion that you got in because you're super smart is nonsense. The reason you got in is because you're white, and more recently because you are black, middle class, upper middle class, the children of diplomats, the children of professors like myself, the children of elite business people. You're not there because your kid is smarter than other kids. You are there because of privilege, and that is wrong. The big question, of course, is why does this continue to happen? And I'm going to cut a very long and complex story short by saying this. What you have after 1994 is a convergence of interests of two groups of people, of white South Africans and of the black middle class South Africans. And that convergence of interests means a blockage of opportunity for children who are not middle class and can afford culturally, financially, socially to be part of those schools. It is in the interest of the black middle class that these schools remain white. Let me be blunt. And that is why it is difficult to change the mind of our government, because where do they send their children to school? Where does my friend Minister Pandor send his children to school? Bishops and Ashel. Where does President Ramaphosa send his school? The very elite schools like Stithians in Johannesburg. So those are in power. The black middle class in power prefers these kinds of arrangements because the rest of the school system is a complete disaster, as we know. And so you have so what sustains the system is those mutually convenient interests of white South Africans and black middle class South Africans. And finally, it is the case, and Grove Primary is a beautiful example of that, that white parents who are activists don't like this either. At Herschel, junior and senior, there are white parents working with black parents to say, we like the fact that our kids are here, but we have to work on amending these policies. Otherwise, and by the way, this is not just good for black kids to get access, it's good for white kids to get normal education, etc. And so on. So, and I know principals, I get asked often to speak at schools around the country, in particular the southern suburbs, more recently. And they say, help us out with transformation. And my answer to them is, I'd gladly help you if you want to change. And very often there's a principal who wants to change, but a governing body that doesn't, or vice versa. So these are complex issues. These schools are not going to change very easily. I'm convinced that the only way it will change is not from the top down, but from the bottom up. When more and more parents say, the world has changed, my children are not going to live in an all-white or a privileged world. I want them to learn with children who don't look like them, who don't pray like them, who don't speak their language, in order for my kids to be more fully human. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very excellent and sobering lecture, Professor Jansen. Let us see if there are any questions. I see no questions in the chat yet. Is there anybody who would like to raise their hand to ask a question? I'm just having a look here quickly. Just hold on a moment.
As a Pentecostal preacher, I have to say I see a hand.
Oh, good. And okay, it's Alta Turan. Alta, please ask your question.
Hi, Prof. Jansen. Thank you for that very interesting lecture. I was just wondering, how do we bring about that solution that you talked about, where parents at these more privileged schools, or the more privileged parents, start wanting to push for transformation within the school? How do we actually cause that solution to happen?
Great question. So, as I said, most schools won't change unless there's pressure on them to change. And so you would notice that a school like Herschel got a black woman principal. I can tell you right now that that would not have happened if there wasn't that major crisis that they had around, the alleged termination of the only black African teacher in the school. I know for a fact that in my case, I would not, regardless of my CV, okay, I would not have become the principal or vice chancellor of the University of the Free State if they didn't have that horrific racist incident, you might recall, from a few years ago. So very often schools make these once-off changes based on a crisis, a major crisis. But that's not the way to change. The best way to change is in peacetime and to forge ahead. One of the things we're suggesting to schools, this is myself, Dylan Ray, and Roy Hellenberg, is to give schools a transformation monitor so that they can actually ask themselves and see on a dashboard, this is what our governing body looks like. This is what our teaching staff looks like. And this is what our student demographic looks like. And that would be very useful, I think, for schools to adopt once we've developed that. But I don't think I think at the end of the day, it's going to depend on parents in the school, not just black parents, but white parents, as you've seen at several schools, who say, listen, we want our school to be more inclusive. We want our school to embrace others. And so let's look at the admissions policy and take another look. As I said, Grove Primary did that with great success, and so on. But better bottom up than top down.
Okay, thank you very much. I see another hand up, but I can't see who the person is. So the hand who's up, would you mind please asking your question?
It's from Okanyo Medi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, leader. I just wanted to ask, preempted by the Young Lions comments there about nationalizing private schools. Does the professor think that it's possible to dissolve the sort of that otherness, that alterity in private schools, especially elite private schools, where their very foundation is premised on that otherness, that separateness, and it's shown in the various elements that you've shown now, that social selection, your school fees, and sort of that's very intrinsic in that sort of capitalist like differentiation from the other. Do you think that it's possible to dissolve all of this to have a truly transformed private school?
That's a really great question. I want to make a distinction between two kinds of schools. I want to make a distinction between those schools in which, as I think you imply, the entire logic of the school's existence is based on, a very ruthless capitalist notion of can you pay or not? If you can pay, you in. If you can't, you're out. I have worked with private schools over the years to suggest to them, listen, there is a way to be compassionate within that ruthlessness. For example, there is no reason whatsoever that a school cannot say, okay, we have this bunch of parents and they can pay, but they're fairly wealthy. We're going to ask them to establish, and I've said this, by the way, to bishops in one of those evening consultations, and why don't you just get these very wealthy alumni of bishops to set up 100 bursaries a year, which is nothing, if your surname is Ackerman or something else. And what you do is to make sure that goes to the most promising kids from schools that will never be able to, or parents from schools who will never be able to afford it, and so on. And that way you gradually transform your school. Whether they said they would do that, whether they actually got that far in the case of bishops is something I'll have to follow up on. But it's not inevitable, okay, that you're going to be stuck in the logic of that. Then, of course, there's other kinds of schools which are less private and more, in my terminology, independent, okay, in which you can make these kinds of moves without, a enormous impact on the budget. A school that saddens me a lot in Cape Town is Springfield. Here's a school that is supposed to be operating on the basis of Christian values, but they're not. They operate on the basis of a ruthless logic around Catholicism and eliteness that keeps out kids. That school is overwhelmingly white. I can't square that with my faith. I can't square that with the values of the great Catholic, leaders in our country, in the world. And unless they change, they will continue to have a scandal because they're not honest. Now, there's a school, again, the logic that drives them is not capitalist, logics only. It is also a sense of being true to the faith. And if you are true to the faith, if you are true to the values of Jesus Christ, then you don't look like Springfield, I'm sorry, and so on. So I think these schools have a lot more room to maneuver. Whether they do it, okay, whether they can go against their own biographies is another matter.
Thank you. I see another hand up, Lance. Perhaps you can see who the person is. I see another hand up to the left of my screen.
Yes, Madi, the question or the hand is raised by Annabelle.
Thank you. Annabelle, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Hi, professors. Thank you so much for the lecture. This was really interesting. I was just wondering if, in terms of disability, if that had been considered when looking at, I know we looked at race and class in terms of getting into elite schools. How does that intersect in terms of like disability for academic success?
Thanks, Annabelle. Great question, too. Look, disability doesn't feature prominently in the minds of schools, etc. More so recently in the minds of universities, but even then, it's often an afterthought as opposed to a forethought, and so on. What we did in this book, which I'm very, very happy about, is we foregrounded, there's a chapter on one school, it's called the Red School in Pinelands, in which the entire logic of the school is to accommodate students with disabilities. The first day I went into that school, the principal stops a bunch of kids and says to them, "What are you proud of?" And they talked about the ramp, the wheelchair ramps. They talked about, by the way, this is also the school with, probably one of the few private schools in the world with gender neutral toilets. How about that? So I mean, that's got nothing to do with disability. I'm just trying to sort of say, if you're going to be a truly inclusive school, most schools don't work on the basis. What drives schools is the ANA tests. What drives schools is their academic performance. What doesn't drive them is, as a primary obsession, is to be inclusive, especially with regards to children with, and teachers, by the way, with disabilities. And that's very sad. But I don't want to leave you guys completely, disillusioned with schools. Please, if you just want to lift your spirit, go to Ann Morton's school, Red School in Pinelands, and there you see that it is possible to do two things: to be a school that is academically excellent on the one hand, and truly inclusive at the same time.
And I'll just ask a question here before we go to another raised hand. There's a question from Leslie, Professor Janssen. She's struggling to get hold of your book. Where is it available?
If Leslie is in Cape Town, the book is available at Exclusive Books. In fact, I just popped in there to Exclusive Books in Cavendish, Claremont this morning to get a copy because I've been giving away all my copies. So I know the Exclusive Book chains have it. I know also that you can order it online via Juters. It's UCT Press Book, but Juters is, as you know, the company. So I know you can also get it online by Juters.
Thank you for that. Lance, again, I can't see the names. Can you see who's got another hand up?
Yes. The next question is by Mila.
Thanks, Lance. Mila?
Thank you, facilitator, and thank you for the lecture that you have given us. Initially, I wanted to ask a question on the nationalization of private schools. Fortunately, Ukhanyo asked the question, but I feel that the professor has not done justice to the question. Actually conceptualized the question very well. The question speaks to the nationalization of private schools, meaning that private schools should be an entity or body of the state, and not, for example, write their own independent examination boards, whatnot. We are not concerned about gestures of philanthropy and which stem from capitalism trying to make itself nice and some Philippines feeling. By having alumni that are convening together to create bursaries for the disadvantaged students from black schools. The question that I'm asking, do you think the nationalization of private schools is a plausible antithesis to the thesis that you have put forward to us here? By nationalization of private schools, we mean all private schools, all schools being under the state, and then that is essentially what the question is to ask, and not about philanthropy in alumni. So my second question is that the prof seems to put a lot of emphasis on white parents depending on a lot of dependence on white parents if whether they approve or do want to change the school. Do you think appealing to white racists to change a white school, do you think it is a plausible solution to the problems that we are facing? Or should rather they be forced either by from the government or the white racist sector or from the people themselves to be on the forefront, be it in the streets, be it in the academic spaces, and trying to push for the nationalization of private schools, and for these private schools to be inclusive of everyone and to be actually free, because I think that should be a third question. Does the professor think that even at the high school, a secondary level, free education is actually something that is possible, understanding, as you have outlined, that many of the students who cannot afford it because of they are black, and because they cannot afford, and why cannot they afford it because of the merits of their skin? So does the professor think that it is possible to make the education in the secondary education and the primary education to be free and accessible for every student? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mila. Great questions. And because I really do think that we need to broaden the scope, of our ambitions here with regards to school change. So I appreciate what you ask. Look, I don't believe that in the nationalization of private schools for two reasons. One is I don't trust this government to not screw it up like it has screwed up everything that's nationalized. Take the SABC, take the PRASA rail system, take the South African Airways. Wherever we've nationalized, we've screwed it up and the poor have suffered. So I have no faith in government being able to nationalize private schools and do a better job of it. In fact, it's very likely that the private schools will look like all the public schools, the majority of the public schools, which is completely underserved by our government. So nationalization is not the answer. I also need to say to you that, in places like Zimbabwe, where this was not a nationalization problem, where you had strong independent schools. In fact, most of Zimbabwe's schools are independent. I studied, my PhD is on Zimbabwe, on the curriculum in Zimbabwean schools. And one of the things that's fascinating about Zimbabwe is that it still has, despite the absolutely corrupt and violent government from Mugabe to the current regime, it still is the place that produces the best students because of the O&A level system, which is another story for a decolonial debate. But despite the poverty and the destruction of the economy, your best students to this day, are students who come out of independent schools, not state schools, Catholic schools and Protestant schools in Zimbabwe. So there's nothing inevitable about either eliteness or exclusion and so on, based simply on the classification of a school as public versus private. I also think, as a libertarian, that parents must be able to choose. If I want to send my kid to a Catholic school, I must have the right to do that. If I want to send my kid to an Anglican school or a not-for-profit school, I should be able to do that. But I don't see any merit in gang pressing everybody into a state school system, which is dysfunctional, even out of the blocks. On the issue of white approval, I don't think every white South African is a racist, so my starting point is different. I think we are all products of our horrible past, and that my role as a public person, as an activist, is to appeal to all of us, is to appeal to the black middle classes, is to appeal to everybody who has privilege, including white South Africans, and sort of say, is there another way of opening up our schools to all our children? And so I don't need anybody's approval for that. But I do believe that one has to make the case for change under the conditions that we have. So as I said, I don't think government, for reasons explained earlier, is going to change its schools. It's not in their interest. And so that activism has to come from outside of the state. Free education is a very important issue Mila raises, because at one level, schools aren't free. Let's just remember that. Schools have never been free. Even though you might not pay tuition fees in the no-fee schools, you're paying in other ways, okay? You still have to buy certain kinds of uniforms and texts, you still have to forego income in the case of high school kids who could have worked to earn money, even if it is at KFC, if you know what I mean. And so the notion of free education is troublesome because it's not really free. Parents pay anyway for education. And so I think the issue here is not free education per se. That's a big issue. The bigger issue is, even if education is free for everyone, can we guarantee that every child has access to a high quality education in order for them to be successful in school and in life? And that is our problem, okay? Of course, I can go off and talk about test results in South Africa, but that's going to waste your time. But I think it shouldn't be difficult to get into school in terms of fees, but once you're in, it must be worth your while educationally, okay, for you to be able to benefit from a good school education.
Thank you. There are a few more questions. If we can just take the last few questions. I see, Lance, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Madipa. Before I go, I do see that there are questions from Gabriel and Daniel Erasmus. So I'm happy for you to take them first.
Okay, let's hear from Gabriel then. Gabriel, are you able to ask your question? Let's see if we can get Gabriel back. Let's ask Daniel in the meantime to ask his question.
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, Prof. So firstly, I just wanted to somewhat respond, like not dialogue, but just to respond on your previous response to Mila's question. You spoke about your lack of faith in the South African government if they were to nationalize private schools. And you also spoke of Zimbabwe and the independent schools remaining successful there despite the issues that occurred there. But then in your justification of the lack of faith in the government, you spoke of these entities that were nationalized, such as SABC and PRASA, etc. But these entities were nationalized prior by the state, by the apartheid government, and they were inherited then by the ANC government and the new government of this country. So then how do you say that when we nationalize things now that it will be a failure, when they were previously nationalized past entities that were inherited, they were obviously bound to fail given the state. I'd like to hear your view on that and why specifically you think that nationalizing schools will fail. Secondly, on that, since you oppose nationalization of schools, this bifurcation of society that will now specifically occur if we keep private schools the way they are, having your white liberal activists making them more accessible in their own like liberal small retained framework, how do we now justify or even reconcile the society that we are creating by doing that? Especially, you mentioned that public schools, state schools are dysfunctional. It's an education system that's dysfunctional. But this is an education system that the majority of the country participates in. So now, how do we say even give kudos to white activists in these schools that are saying, okay, no, now we're going to have a black head, or we're going to push transformation, or we're going to have more scholarships. How do we reconcile that? And how do we give kudos to people who are actually perpetuating that bifurcation of society, perpetuating this upper elite class that will benefit from capitalism further and will continue to perpetuate the violence that occurs when people are relegated to poorer education systems, dysfunctional education systems, in your own words. And then lastly, I think this ties into everything I've been kind of questioning on here, is how do we actually decolonize these private schools? For me, I'll state it straight: we have to nationalize these schools. There's no other way to look at it. Ontologically, these schools are exclusionary. How do we now expect a private school that is embedded in, or even not just private schools, but like upper Model C, past former Model C schools, where their existence is is founded in white supremacy and continues to exist in white supremacy, how do we now expect them to decolonize when that essentially would mean they would self-destruct? Surely the only way then is for them to be nationalized, or for a different way of managing such schools. Otherwise, yeah, as I think I've made very clear, we'll never get past this bifurcation of society that we currently see ourselves in. Thank you.
Professor Jansen, are you able to answer that question?
I don't think that was a question.
Okay, that's just a statement. Well, let me go then and let me read Gabriel's comment. He said, I was just going to say that in Zimbabwe, we had nationalization of church schools in the 70s that went wrong. Standards fell, so nationalization is not always a solution. We should also realize that some public schools can be elitist even if they don't appear so. Also, the state may not even have sufficient funds to run the schools they nationalize when they struggle with a few that they have. Zambia is not Zimbabwe. So
yeah, I don't know enough about Zambia, but but certainly on the Zimbabwean schools, they have maintained over the years really outstanding school education under the independent flag. And I think that's worth acknowledging. I mean, to this day, I still am much more likely to take a student from Zimbabwe than from South Africa, based simply on the solid academic, foundations of those students. And they all succeed. They all succeed with great, with ease, actually. In fact, last year, I nominated a student to study civil engineering at WITS, who couldn't afford to get in, even though she had 90% in every subject from a Northwest school in South Africa. And she just sent me her results, and she got 80 and 90% in almost every subject in the first year of civil engineering at WITS, which, trust me, doesn't happen often. So that's testament again to a school, to an independent school system that has really served Zimbabwe well.
Excellent story. Let's hear Lance's question, and then I think after Lance we'll take one more question. Then it is now nearly 2:20, so I think we must draw to a close. So Lance, let's hear your question.
Sure. Daniel touched on parts of it when he spoke about, decolonizing private schools. And I want to raise a point based on what you mentioned about the, the alumni of these private schools making bursaries available to deserving children. So like in the instance where these children are black or colored, going to bishops or SACS, etc. is one thing, but the kind of behaviors or lifestyles or personalities that these children adopt while attending those schools are like what concerns me. Like we see these children we see these people entering university with very white-like behaviors, with liberal ways of thinking. And I've had experiences with a few peers who went to schools like this, who all of a sudden became very classist or colorist, very disconnected from the struggles of black and colored people. And I've noticed that it's almost like they lose the identity at these elite schools. Do you have any? So I want to ask if you have any suggestions or thoughts on what these schools can do in that regard, or how to circumvent this problem from occurring.
Yeah, it's a serious problem, and it's Look, access is one thing. So a lot of my talk today obviously has been about making sure that there is equity. Or some semblance of equity with regard to accessing the schools. That is a completely different question from what happens once you're inside the school. Now, I don't take a hard line on this that that you're going to go into any school system and come out exactly like that school. I think all of us that have been in different kinds of school systems, different kind of university systems, there are good things and bad things that you get out of these kinds of cultures. But it is absolutely true that if you go into an elite from a white school in South Africa and you come out, with the kinds of values that are racist and classist and sexist in boys' schools especially, then then I question what the value is of that education to begin with. Now, again, these are things I talk about at schools around the country on a regular basis. We've written books about this, such as The School Where I Belong, which is also available in the bookshop, in order to make schools aware of that other. I said the other day at a Rondebosch school, I said, your school will probably give you good results in math and science. I really don't know. It's a boys' school. Whether they will teach you how to value women. I don't know if they will teach you how to be respectful of people from other faiths and that kind of thing. So you're quite right. The access is only one thing. The value system is a completely different thing. But as in all value systems, there are good things in it and there are bad things in it. And we should pay attention. I just want to say one other thing. Even though this book is about, the elite former white schools in South Africa, all my other work and all my other books is in fact about how do we create in the broader public school system outstanding schools, and so that is where most of my energies go every single day, because even if you were able theoretically to transform all of these fancy schools, you still have 29,000 schools in the system, most of which are not working for our children. And so that's where most of my energy goes in trying to change schools.
Okay, I'm going to really call it a day now. Lance, again, I can't see the people's names, so the hand that's been up the longest, can we take that as a very last question, please?
Sure, the hand that has been up the longest is that of Okanyo.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear your question.
Thank you once again, Chair. And yeah, it's a pity that we have to end soon, because I think this is a very important engagement that we're having now. I think Fighter Mina and Fighter Daniel and equally our undergraduate chair there, Lance, touched on this important point briefly. And I think it was the fundamental principle in the question I asked originally. And it was a question of like the hegemony and the very foundational structure of these elite private schools. Yes, obviously an aspect of that is that capitalistic business logic that the professor was speaking about. But I think fundamentally it is a question of their philosophies and their ways of thinking and their ways of being, their value systems and how in which they want to engage with certain bodies in those spaces. And so fundamentally my question was, does the professor think that it is ever possible for a private school, whether independent or an elite school or whatever terminology the professor wishes to take, for that specific school, understanding its history, the reason why they started, in order to exclude certain members of the society from the others. There's a reason why they got their first principals or their headmasters from England. There's the reason why there is a disconnect between the students that go to these schools and the students that go to your state schools and so on and so forth. There's a reason why there's an assimilation culture that takes place when a black body enters these schools. So my question was, is it possible at all, without nationalizing, to dissolve this hegemony, this foundational inherent hegemony that focuses on this colonial thinking, that focuses on this Western ways of viewing things and viewing people? Is it possible to dissolve that for these bodies? I think Fighter Daniel once said to me after I think it was the St. Andrews webinar, that in fact to ask schools to engage in any sort of discourse on decolonization and decolonial thinking is effectively to ask them to deconstruct. And essentially, like, my question is, what are the professor's thoughts on those things? Is it possible to dissolve these alterities? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kanyo. Look, guys, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm older and I've seen things and I study things that are complicated. That I don't believe that by being angry and wielding the heavy hand of the state that you change anything. I just don't believe that. Okay, the reason decolonization, failed at our universities, despite what I thought was a very promising start, was because people were more angry than intellectual. They weren't thinking. They weren't thinking about how institutions work and therefore how to change it. And so everybody seemed to think great things are going to happen, but our universities are exactly the same as they were before 2015. So I think it's very important to when you approach the problem of change, to ask, how do we get deep change given the reality in front of us, okay? And the reality in front of us is that you have very old institutions that correctly, as you said, are very immersed in a particular culture of an identity that is not going to change just because we, use words like hegemony and words like, we're going to have to be smart about radical change. That's the point I want to make, and it's the subject of a new book that we're just about to put out. So hear me out here, okay? Hear me out that when I say that the reason these schools exist is because of a convergence of interests of the black middle classes and the and white interests. That means we've got to be smart about how to change that situation. A lot of you have spoken now in the last round. I'm convinced you're not sending your kids to poor public schools because you're part of the elite. Okay, you're part of that group of South Africans, including myself, who will seek out the best schools, for your children. And so I want to be practical here and sort of say, before we can figure out how to change the schools, we first have to understand what keeps them going. And the way to get there is to understand what interests, what political interests, what social interests, what cultural interests underpin these particular arrangements. But no, nationalization, I don't know, guys, but I tend to pay attention to nationalization around the world. It has not worked. It's not worked in much part of the world, and it certainly won't work here, where nationalization almost always is simply an excuse for corruption on the part of the new elites, and I certainly won't be part of that. And that's not the way you change schools. You change schools through a smart politics that is not just persuasion, but also new policies. And I don't see any of that happening on the part of government at the very least. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to have to draw it to a close now. I just want to say, I know there were people who joined late. What we will do is we will send the recording of the link to the entire group of people who were in the lecture. Those who joined late, you will get it next week. We just need to download it, so you can listen again to this lecture if you want to. But just to say, Professor Jansen, it's been an absolute privilege to have you. And I'm keeping my eye open for your new book, and hopefully we can ask you to do another online lecture for us in the year about your new book.